The dust devils danced like spirits across the scorched, unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory, mocking Jedediah Jed Stone's solitary existence. His ranch, a scatter of sun-bleached wood and creaking fences, clung stubbornly to a dry patch of desert like a man refusing to be forgotten. It was a life carved from sand and silence, a place where the sky stretched too wide and the days bled into each other, with only the changing winds and endless toil to mark their passage. Since Sarah's death, the ranch had grown quieter, lonelier. The home they once filled with laughter had become a husk of what was echoing with absence. Jed bore it like he bore everything else, without complaint, without reprieve. He was a man etched by time, his frame lean and solid, his skin leathered by years under the blistering sun. The lines on his face weren't just from age, they were carved there by grief, by solitude, by the relentless push to survive. His hands, rough as barn rope and calloused from decades of work, moved with the precision of a man who lived by routine and necessity. It was on one sweltering afternoon, the kind where the air clung like hot wool, that Jed's path veered sharply from the ordinary. He was tracking a stray calf near the far edge of his property. His eyes narrowed against the shimmering heat haze. The land stretched out in waves of gold and red dust, but something foreign caught his eye, a strange shape, standing out against the desolation. As he drew closer, a sickening weight settled in his gut. There, tied to a crude wooden post driven into the sun-baked ground, was a woman. Her clothes hung in tattered strips, stained with dirt and sweat, and her head hung low, unmoving. A thick, iron chain bit into her raw wrists, glinting in the brutal light. She looked like something abandoned by the world, a discarded soul left to die beneath the pitiless sun. Jed's pulse quickened, a cold dread piercing the heat. He'd seen cruelty out here, bandits, drifters, the desperate and the damned, but this was something different. This was savage, personal, and wrong. He approached cautiously, his fingers brushing the grip of his cold peacemaker, just in case the scene wasn't as it seemed. The woman stirred as his shadow fell over her, her body tensing like a cornered animal. When she finally lifted her face, her eyes met his wide with fear, red-rimmed from sun and tears. Her skin was streaked with grime, her lips cracked, but there was something alive still burning behind her gaze, a flicker of defiance. He crouched down, voice low and gravelly from disuse. "Ma'am, what happened?" Her voice was barely a breath, but he caught it. They were taking me, to sell me. Just 6 words, and yet they hit him like a blow to the ribs. Jed felt the old rage stir deep, primal, heavy. Out here, justice was a distant thing. The law didn't always ride fast enough, or far enough. A woman left like this was a death sentence. His jaw clenched as he looked from her bruised wrists to her haunted eyes, and without another word, he drew his pistol, steadied his aim, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of gunfire tore through, the silence echoing across the desert. The chain snapped with a sharp metallic clink. He holstered his weapon and stood, holding out a hand roughened by seasons of work. "Name's Jedediah Stone," he said. "You're comin' with me." She hesitated, her eyes locked on his, searching for something, truth, mercy, perhaps a sliver of hope. Then, after a moment that felt endless, she placed her hand in his. Her grip was small, but it didn't tremble. It was steady, determined, even in her broken state. He helped her up, careful not to startle her. Her legs shook under her weight, but she didn't fall. Jed wrapped an arm around her shoulders, supporting her as they made the long walk back to the ranch. He didn't speak, and neither did she. Words seemed too fragile for the moment. Back at the ranch, he moved with quiet urgency. He gave her water first, holding the tin cup to her lips as she drank in desperate gulps. Then came food, salted meat, cornbread, whatever he had on hand. He set her up in the spare room, Sarah's old room, and brought her one of Sarah's dresses, worn but clean. She changed behind a closed door while he sat on the porch, the sun dipping low behind the hills. He didn't know who she was or what would follow, but something inside him had shifted, locked into place like a wagon wheel catching a groove. Her name, he learned, was Ara. She said little, just that she'd been heading west when they caught her. No names, no faces, just they. That was enough. He didn't push. He saw the way her hands twitched in her sleep, the way her eyes darted to the door at every sound. She was wounded in ways no doctor could fix, so he gave her space. He made the house quiet and safe. The dress he gave her hung loose on her thin frame, but she wore it with dignity. At night, he listened to the creak of the floorboards, the familiar sounds of a home that no longer felt entirely his alone. The bell above the front door, rarely used, hung still in the warm night air. But inside Jed's mind, something had already begun to ring. A warning, a calling, a reckoning. In the days that followed, they moved around each other in a delicate rhythm. Ara was slow to trust, her steps hesitant, her glances fleeting. But she helped gathering eggs, sweeping the porch, cooking simple meals when her hands were steady enough. Jed, a man used to the silence of his own making, began to speak more than he had in years. Small things, explanations, letting her know where he was going, what he was doing. Words meant to build a fragile bridge. At night, they ate in silence, the scrape of cutlery and the distant yip of coyotes their only company. He noticed the way she flinched at loud sounds, how her hand drifted toward the knife under her pillow. When wind rattled the shutters, she never said more about what had been done to her. He never asked. Healing, he knew, came in time, but word travels fast in the territories, even when it has no legs. Old man Hemlock, a weary prospector with more years than teeth, came by one morning with a bag of flour and a sharp look. "Heard you got yourself a woman, Jed," he croaked, eyes narrowing. Jed didn't answer, just kept hammering a fence post into place. He knew what Hemlock was implying. A lone rancher, suddenly with a woman no one knew, was enough to stir suspicion. Or worse. Then came the storm. It brewed on the horizon like God's own anger, the sky turning a fierce shade of purple and orange. The wind picked up first, whispering through the grass, then roaring across the hills. Dust swirled like smoke. Devils. As Jed shuttered the windows, Ara stood beside him, pale and still. That evening, lit by the flicker of a kerosene lamp, she finally spoke. They were a gang, Jed, 3 men. They said they'd sell me to the highest bidder. In town. Her voice cracked, thick with old fear. She looked at him, eyes hollow but honest. "I don't have anyone, no family, nothin'." Jed stared at her, heart thudding. He knew that loneliness, knew it too damn well. "You're safe here, Ara," he said simply, the words heavy with promise. But inside, the storm that howled outside had already planted a seed, a thought he couldn't shake. She wasn't safe, not really. Not just because she was here. The men who hurt her might come back, and if they did, this ranch and its fences wouldn't be enough. The next morning, dawn clear and bright, the air crisp after the storm. But Jed felt a restlessness settle in his bones. He spent the day in motion, clearing limbs, repairing damage, watching Ara out of the corner of his eye. She still flinched at shadows. She still clutched that knife like it was her lifeline. That afternoon, while she hung laundry in the backyard, her hair pulled back and her sleeves rolled to her elbows, he approached with his head in hand. His mouth was dry, his pulse uneven. He hadn't said the words out loud yet, not even to himself, but they felt too heavy to carry any longer. "Ara," he began, his voice rougher than usual. She turned, her expression cautious. "I've been thinking." He paused, his gaze drifting across the endless stretch of land. "You need protection. More than I can give you just by keeping you here." Her eyes widened slightly, brows drawing together in quiet confusion. He cleared his throat, forced the words out. "Best way for a woman to be safe in these parts, to have a name and a place, is to be married." Ara blinked, stunned, silent. Her lips parted, then closed. She looked away, her face flushing with something he couldn't read. "Married," she whispered, tasting the word. Jed nodded slowly, jaw tight. "To me." He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the doubt. It wasn't love he was offering, not yet. But it was something solid, something real. "I ain't got much, Ara," he said. "This ranch, it's a hard life, but it's honest. And I can promise you no one will ever lay a hand on you again. I'll protect you." With my last breath, the wind stirred the laundry between them. Ara stood still, her fingers gripping the edge of a linen sheet, her face unreadable. But Jed waited. No matter her answer, the words were out now, alive and thundering between them. And whatever came next, whether it was hope or heartbreak, it would be faced together. The silence between them stretched long and heavy, thick with the weight of the moment. Ara lowered her eyes to her hands, then lifted her gaze to the vast, sun-bleached plains that lay beyond the ranch. That sky, endless and harsh, had once felt like a prison, but now it held a strange kind of promise. She thought of the chain that had dug into her wrists, of the suffocating dust, the terror in the back of the wagon. And then she thought of Jed, of the steadiness in his voice, the quiet strength in his eyes, and the unexpected gentleness of a man who had no reason to help her and every reason not to. This wasn't a marriage born of affection, not the kind little girls dreamed of. There were no roses, no soft words, no borrowed poetry. But in a world this hard, love wasn't always the foundation. Sometimes it was survival. Sometimes it was the sheer need for safety, for stability. What Jed was offering wasn't wrapped in sentiment. It was rooted in something deeper, an instinct to protect, to give her space to breathe. She saw no hunger in his eyes, no desire to own her or possess her. What she saw was something far more rare, a solemn vow of responsibility. He wasn't asking for anything. He was offering everything. She drew in a slow breath, the kind that scraped the ribs. Her voice, when it came, was clear and certain, despite the tremor in her chest. "Jedediah Stone," she said, her eyes locking with his. "Are you offering me a life or just a name?" He didn't flinch. "A life, Ara," he said simply. "A chance to be safe, to build something, to be free." She looked up at the rusted bell that hung above the porch, still and silent, catching the last gold rays of the evening sun. It hadn't rung yet, but she felt the echo of it in her chest. Something was changing. A decision had been made. "Yes, Jedediah," she whispered, a thread of steel threading her voice. "I'll marry you." The journey to Redemption Creek was quiet, the road ahead long and dry, lined with brittle sage and wind-carved rocks. Jed drove the buckboard with his usual stillness, his hands firm on the reins. Ara sat beside him, dressed in one of Sarah's old gowns, a simple wedding dress, mended and pressed. It smelled faintly of lavender and cedar, the last remnants of a life long gone. The fabric felt heavy, like it bore the weight of unspoken hopes and the shadow of the woman who'd worn it before. They didn't speak much. The air was thick with anticipation, with questions neither dared ask aloud. Jed knew how Redemption Creek would see them. A reclusive rancher riding into town with a strange woman. In a borrowed dress, it would stir whispers like dry leaves on the wind. But his jaw was set, his spine straight. This wasn't about appearances. It was about keeping her safe. The town appeared slowly, rising from the dust like a memory half-formed. Weathered storefronts leaned into the sun. A saloon, with its paint long peeled, a general store with a porch of crooked boards, and a church that had seen too many funerals and too few weddings. To Ara, the place felt suffocating, not in its size, but in its eyes, the way strangers stared like they could taste the weight of her past. Jed walked beside her, steady and unbothered. He took her straight to the preacher's small office. Behind the church, it smelled of old leather, paper, and pipe smoke. Preacher Silas, a big man with a thunderous voice and soft eyes, blinked in surprise when he saw them. "Well, I'll be Jed Stone," he said, rising to his feet. "And who's this fine young lady?" Jed didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We've come to be wed, preacher. Now, if you've got time." Silas raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He'd done enough shotgun weddings and quick unions to recognize the urgency in Jed's voice, and something in Ara's expression gave him pause. She looked tired to the bone, wary, but unbroken. The preacher nodded, ushering them into the chapel. The small church was mostly empty, but a few townsfolk followed out of curiosity. Their whispers rustled like leaves, soft and judgmental. The air inside was thick with dust and sunlight that filtered through grimy windows, casting long shafts of gold across the floorboards. As Preacher Silas began to speak, his words echoed off the old wood, ancient and sacred, even in this forgotten corner of the world. Jed held Ara's hand gently, and though it was cold in his, there was no tremble. When his time came to speak, his vow was clear and firm, delivered with the quiet gravity of a man who said little and meant everything. Era's voice was softer, but it carried. She looked up at him not as a savior, not even as a husband, but as the man who had seen her broken and still offered her a future. When the preacher declared them husband and wife, the old bell in the tower, unused for years, began to toll, slow and deep. Once, twice, the sound stretched across the town like a signal something had changed. But even before the echoes died, a dark silhouette appeared in the doorway. The light of the setting sun poured in behind him, casting his face in shadow, but Ara knew that outline. Her breath caught in her chest. It was him. Silas Snake Evans, the man who'd chained her like livestock, who'd laughed while she cried, who had vowed to sell her to the highest bidder. His eyes gleamed with cruelty as they fixed on her hand, now bearing a simple wedding band. A sneer curled across his lips. The bell kept ringing, but its sound felt distant now, overtaken by a new, icy silence. Jed shifted subtly, his arm sliding around Era's waist, his free hand resting against the butt of his revolver. His entire frame had tensed not with fear, but with resolve. Preacher Silas stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Is there a problem here?" "Mr. Evans," Snake let out a low, humorless chuckle. "No problem, preacher. Just here to offer my congratulations and remind this lady of some previous arrangements." His eyes locked on Era's, filled with menace and ownership. She flinched. "Jed didn't. She's my wife now," Jed said, his voice like distant thunder. "She's under my protection. You want trouble? Snake, you'll find it in me." The drifter's smile faded into a hard scowl. He'd heard tales of Jed Stone, knew he wasn't the kind of man you crossed lightly. But Snake was proud, cruel, and reckless. He and Jed locked eyes in a quiet, deadly standoff. The room held its breath. Finally, Snake spat on the floor, the sound sharp in the silence. "This ain't over, Stone," he hissed. "You can't keep her locked away forever." And then he turned, the church door groaning shut behind him. As the shadows swallowed him whole, relief flooded the room like rain after drought. But Jed knew that Snake's words weren't empty. Trouble was coming. This was only the beginning. Back at the ranch, the truth of what they'd done began to settle in. Their union wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't flowers and lace. It was to people binding themselves together against the world. Ara sat on the porch that evening, watching the hills, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Jed stood nearby, silently fixing a saddle strap, his eyes always drifting back to her. Their bond wasn't built on sweet words. It was forged in fire and trauma, in protection, in long silences that spoke more than conversation ever could. But slowly, something grew. Ara learned to hold a rifle, to ride without fear, to patch a fence without hesitation. She grew stronger, not because Jed taught her how, but because he gave her the space to remember that she could. And Jed, who hadn't known companionship since Sarah's death, began to find a strange peace in Era's quiet presence. He'd wake at dawn to find her already outside, tending to the chickens. He'd come in from the range to find supper simmering, and her humming softly under her breath. The ranch began to change not in appearance, but in spirit. It was no longer a place to be endured. It was becoming a home. But the threat never left. Snake's gang lingered like storm clouds on the edge of a clear sky. They saw signs, hoofprints too close to the southern fence, a shadow in the tree line at dusk. They raised their walls, practiced their aim, and spoke little of what they both feared. Each confrontation they survived made them lean more into one another. Jed began to sleep better knowing she was under his roof, and Ara, who once clutched a knife through the night, began to rest without fear. Their love didn't come all at once. It grew slowly, like roots winding through dry earth. It was in the way he handed her a rifle with quiet trust, in the way she looked at him when she brought him coffee at sundown. It was in the shared glances after a long day's work, in the silence that now felt warm instead of cold. The bell that had rung on their wedding day no longer symbolized urgency. Now it stood as a sentinel over the ranch, a memory of the day everything changed, of the moment broken lives found shelter in each other. In a land that had taken so much from them both, they built something lasting, not built on romance, but on respect, on quiet sacrifice, on choosing one another again and again. Even as the dust threatened to rise again, And in that harsh, unforgiving country, where even the strongest men were shaped by the land, Jed Stone, and Ara found something rare and enduring: partnership, born of pain, made of steel, and softened only by the grace of their growing love.